Hi guys, this is Fernando doing another video for More Survival. It's continuing with the topic of knots. As fun as it is, and the first one was, this is, I'd say it's a bit better. In the first video it was kind of boring. We laid a few basic concepts about knots, and this one is going to be a bit better because it's more of the practical application of some of those basic concepts that we saw in the first video. You remember that we talked about the overhand knot, the simple granddaddy of all knots. The simple overhand knot. Well, applying that concept, we can come up with something a bit more interesting. If we are doing, for example, an overhand loop, all you have to do is, right, doubling it over, you just do the same old thing, and you have a loop, right? It's not the greatest knot there is, but it's pretty practical and very useful and extremely fast to do. If, for example, you have to do a loop on a line, for example, you have a fishing line of some sort and you have to put a loop in the middle of it, or several of these loops, you just do the same thing. You get a bite like that and you do the overhand knot, and you will have a loop in your line. And as much as you pull on it, it's going to be jamming pretty bad, but it's not going to be coming apart. And if you have something tied up here, well, you have a little anchor point of some sort. Another cool thing that you can do with the overhand knots, that's cool in my opinion, I don't know, maybe you guys don't think it's fun or anything. On our working end, we do an overhand knot. Okay, then we do another overhand knot, and we end up with something that's called the Canadian jam knot. What's this good for? It's for jamming things pretty bad. If you want to tighten it a lot like this, you see how it's doing it around my arm? Just pull it, and it's gonna be you know, it's tightening pretty nice. And all you have to do to untie it, I mean, I can barely, I feel the tendons as I move it. It's tightening a lot. All I have to do to untie it and to release it a little bit is pulling this end. That's pretty cool. Okay, maybe you have to do you lost your arm and you have to tie it bad like that. You pull it, tightens pretty nice, and you pull it on this little end to release. It's sometimes used for gear, for tightening it, for compacting like sleeping bags or gear, whatever. You can use this knot for that. Now the bad thing is that, remember what I said in the first video, that the overhand knot tends to jam pretty bad. Well, one variation of the Canadian jam knot is that you can use, for example, instead of using two overhand knots, remember what I said in the first video about the figure 8 knot. Instead of doing the first one an overhand knot, we can do a figure 8 knot. Okay, coming that way, right? The first one is just a figure 8 knot, which is gonna be more easy to undo, and it's not gonna be jamming nearly as bad. Right now, yes, we do the overhand knot here, and the result's pretty much the same. You just have a knot, you see, tightens pretty nice. And when you have to release it, you just pull it. But in this case, it's easier to undo. So if it's important to you not to lose a little bit of end of your rope, of your cord, you can do that instead. Right, let's keep moving on. Another knot that you can use that's like within the family of the overhand knots is the Fisherman's knot. Right, we have to join two ends, two cords. We simply do an overhand knot here. Okay, overhand knot here, and on this other line, overhand knot here as well. This, when it pulls together like that, it is a pretty neat way of joining two pieces of cordage. If you're using a fishing line, for example, that tends to slip a bit more, you may need to be doing a double fisherman's or even triple fisherman's knot. It's basically doing the same thing but with a couple more loops instead. Right, we come through it that way, and when we pull like that, okay, on one end, it's basically the same thing, just doing another turn before coming through. One, two, there we go. And then when we come back here, can do double or triple depending on how much you need. Right, same thing, pretty solid knot to join. Okay, but again, it's gonna be, especially if you're using a very thin line or a fishing line, something like that, it may be a bit harder to pull these apart. So as you see, these are all things that you just use applying that simple knot we saw at first. It's simple overhand, the humble overhand knot. Just applying it and using it in different ways. About the figure 8 knot, remember that I told you guys that it's used sometimes for climbing. Well, it's actually used a lot for climbing because it's one of the safest knot you can use to tie to your harness. So basically what you are doing is that same thing that we talked about at first. You do a figure 8 knot, okay, which is going to be something like that. Figure 8 knot. Now what you do in climbing is you put the working end through your harness, and then what you do is follow through that same knot that you made, that same figure 8 knot that you made. You just follow through all the way, following exactly how it went the first time, following through all over again. Start again with a bit more rope because kind of not having enough of it. Have a figure 8. We do it pretty loosely. Working in goes through your harness. If you go rock climbing or something like that in some class or something like that, the guys are probably not going to be trusting you to do this yourself because it's kind of the most crucial part and the thing that gets most people killed, doing this knot the wrong way. So it's kind of one of those neat things to know and practice. And we end up going through. Again, you basically follow through again, right? But it's basically the same concept. It's still the same figure 8 knot that we mentioned at first, right? This is gonna be one of the safest knots there is. Sometimes they do the fisherman's knot here as well, so he has to secure this or put a stopper knot here just in case it starts slipping or something like that. But the concept is that one. It's pretty simple. It's simple as long as you do practice these things. If you never practice these knots, you tend to forget them. So keep that in mind. Finally, one more. Variation in the sheath bend knot. Instead we can do the sheath bend knot again. Remember how that went? If we did this, what did we have? We have the reef or square knot. Instead of doing that, what we're going to be doing is just going under here, alright? That gives us the sheath bend knot. Right? Now, instead of doing this, this is going to be a good knot to joining two pieces of cordage in spite of different diameter and such. But one of the things, the variations we can do, instead of doing that, we just pull through a loop instead of all of it. Right? When that happens, what we end up with is this. Right? Instead of pulling it all the way through, just a little bite goes through. This is pretty solid, pretty strong until you pull this end. When you pull this, it comes apart. So if you need to join these two cords and you need a way of joining it, but that it's still very simple and very fast to disengage both of these, that's the knot you would be using. Right, so just a few more knots for you to keep in mind, and these are, I think these are pretty cool because they're a bit more practical. So I'm probably going to be doing a final video on some of the final knots I have there for you guys to keep in mind. Try to practice these so as to remember them, and have a good day. Remember to subscribe and see you on the next video.